As a car enthusiast, it happens sometimes where you're walking around a car meet and you see a few substandard cars. I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to name models. What are some of the most cursed car mods that I have purchased or installed on my own cars? I've put together a list of 5 of my favorite auto items that I have purchased. And I think you'll find some pleasure in hearing my reason behind some of these at the time. Welcome to the Laughing Wrench. My name is Steven, and I've been into cars since Need for Speed Pro Street came out on the Nintendo Wii. I've owned and have been modifying cars for almost 9 to 10 years now, and you'll learn that over the course of the podcast that I have been quite the Mitsubishi fan, in particular the Lancer platform. For those of you who are interested in the specs of cars, I know I sure am. My first car was a Mitsubishi Lancer SE, which had a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, front-wheel drive, manual of course, and it had about 150 horsepower. The second car I had, which I owned for about 3 years, was once again a Mitsubishi Lancer, this time GTS. It was a 2.4-liter with 168 horsepower that I had a few mods to spice it up to about 180, which leads me to my third and current car of the Mitsubishi, you guessed it, Lancer Evolution, commonly referred to as the Evo X, which currently produces about 420 from its 300 stock. And as your average car enthusiast, I think everybody goes through the same trajectory of starting out wanting the most performance for the least amount of money possible. And I think this is probably the single-handed biggest mistake when it comes to modifying cars in the car community. There will be a time and place in a future episode where we talk about my current car and all the fun I'm having with it, but I think for this episode, we should not stray from the main event of all of the cursed car modifications that got me to where I am today. Since this is the first podcast I've ever recorded, it's probably not going to be a first take Jake, one take Jake style podcast, so just bear with me as I try to make the transitions as seamless and as quiet as possible so that it's not a very quick cut YouTube video style. We're going to start off guns blazing with Octane Booster. Yes, I'm sure you have heard of Octane Booster and all of its bold claims to improve performance, give you all the power you need, clean your fueling system, and make your car just perform better. What is Octane Booster? This is something that I had purchased for my first car when I was in the first car stage of my life. And it was something that I bought because I thought it would make my car go zoom. Now, it almost seems like the companies that produce these kinds of products almost prey on the introductory car enthusiast to make their sales. And, you know, you'll typically see all these big flames and like performance in bold letters on the bottle, which would really just make you attracted to this eye candy packaging as you're walking down the car products aisle. And so it typically runs you about $10 to $20, and what you'll do is you will put it into your gas tank while you're filling it up at the pump, and it will boost your points, your octane point, from about 87 to 90, 95, 100, 105, what have you, based on the potency of the product. Now, most cars will absolutely not be affected by this. Yes, there are some cars that have timing systems where they will advance the timing based on the octane reading in the fuel, but most cars don't have this. Now, the reason that I bought it for my car is because I thought I would go fast with it. And I was very, very, disheartened when you put it in your tank, you floor it, and you want it to feel fast. You want it to feel like you've gained 20, 30 horsepower, but when I put it in and floored it, it was the same. But it didn't feel like it. It felt like my car was faster, and that was a placebo. Typically, the rule of thumb when it comes to modifying cars is that you have to increase the amount of power that your car is producing by 10 to 15% to feel it on the butt dyno. For that, I'm giving this product E tier. Moving on, the next cursed car mod is going to be nitrous. And nitrous is an extremely controversial car mod because you have many people that love it and many people that hate it. And you know, both sides are justified, right? It's easy power, it's cheap power, but it's extremely dangerous power. Not to mention that the reoccurring costs of filling your nitrous bottle will outweigh the cost of turboing your car in the long run. Now, when it comes to nitrous, you pretty much have two options as delivery. You can either install a dry nitrous injection system, which simply injects dry. Why am I saying dry? It's not even dry. It's just injecting the nitrous gas, nitrous oxide, into your engine. When it comes to the wet kit, you're actually going to be injecting the nitrous and you're going to be injecting fuel into your intake at the same time. And why this system is a lot safer, the reason is because in the dry system, you're expected to manually compensate with fuel, either in your tune or just figure it out, right? But when it comes to the wet kit, you have a fuel nozzle and you have a nitrous nozzle. So you can kind of tune your own air-fuel ratio mixture on your own, without the need of a tune, without the need to mess around with your timing. And this is something that's very attractive to intro car enthusiasts. Remember, we want the most power for the least money. Nitrous has a time and place, and you know, with the benefit of hindsight, that place is not in the engine bay of a car that Mitsubishi designed for the family. It's not. It's for racing, right? It's for racing. It's for drag racing. And this is the problem, right? Because drag racing teams that install nitrous have the budget and the expertise to install it. People like me, starting off, learning how to mess around with cars, don't, right? And that was one of the problems that I had started to encounter towards the end. And this is kind of why I call it cursed, because I installed a 50 shot of nitrous onto my car, right? Which is super great, which means I gain 50 horsepower every time I press the button. The problem with this is that the power delivery is so abrupt that it would start spinning my clutch and roasting my clutch every time I would use it in third and fourth gear. Now, this is a pretty mild problem when it comes to nitrous. In the grand scheme of problems that you can encounter when it comes to nitrous, it can get worse, right? And oftentimes what you'll see on YouTube, which ultimately I think turns a lot of people off when it comes to nitrous, is like the car is on the dyno screaming, "Wah!" And then they hit the button, boom, engine explodes. And you know, a big reason for this is just incorrect fuel mixture, right? Like if you run it way too lean, and I'm not going to go too into details on these things, but when you run it way too lean, you're just producing a situation where detonation will occur. Stack that on top of the way too much power you're probably making for the current engine it's on, and you have just landed yourself in a situation where Mr. Rodney is knocking at your door. That's why I would probably put nitrous as B tier, because if done properly, brilliant modification. And, you know, to my credit, I did install it somewhat properly. But I would advise you to proceed with extreme caution if this is a road you choose to go down. The third cursed car mod that I want to talk about is an exhaust cutout. For those of you who don't know what an exhaust cutout is, you can also refer to it as a diverter, as a dump, and basically what it is, imagine a Y. The stem of the Y is the natural flow of your exhaust, and it's just going to continue down to your muffler. Now you cut your exhaust stream and you install this Y. The exhaust enters the stem and it can either exit through one branch of the Y to your normal exhaust system, or it can exit through the other branch of the Y, which typically is just right out to the ground. It just stops right where it is, and that's it. Typically, this will be installed for performance or sound reasons, and it can be a very dramatic modification. This is something I had bought for my current car, the Evo 10, and I think it was probably my first or second modification that I bought for it. My car, when I bought it, it was completely stock, or mostly stock, exhaust-wise anyways, and I wanted it to make a little bit more noise. And I was, looking around for options, and I saw the cutout was a relatively inexpensive option at the time. So I had a welder install it for me just after the resonator. And the problem was it was installed a bit low. Needless to say, it got ripped off the car or severely damaged before I could make it home that day. Now, that is not the reason why I'm going to be placing the exhaust cutout as a C tier, but the reason is because it's just too cheap of a mod. I find it a very distasteful mod for a car because it's just a very extravagant, very expressive, loud, obnoxious kind of modification that you can do to your car. And especially the closer you put it to your engine, right? Like if you're putting this right downstream of your car's exhaust manifold, you are going to make so many decibels. This is something that I'm very proud to say was purchased 4 years ago and was the last low quality modification I have ever purchased in my life. Well, maybe not. I have one more really good low quality. Well, I have two more actually, but this one's really good. I think you'll enjoy it. It can kind of, in a weird world, be referred to as a car mod because it's modifying the way you drive your car, or specifically when you drive your car, right? It's a daily. This is going to be an E tier car modification. And what is it? It was a 2008 Subaru Impreza. Now I know what you're thinking. Mitsubishi guy? What's he doing driving a Subaru? Well, you know, this whole Mitsubishi versus Subaru rivalry is frankly pretty trivial, right? Subaru individuals like Mitsubishis, typically, and Mitsubishi individuals typically like Subarus. But this Subaru Impreza was a bit special because in typical Subaru fashion, the engine had already been replaced by the time I got to it. But that's not what makes this car special. What makes this car special is that the people who had replaced the engine had replaced it with a worse performing engine compared to the one that came in the car, right? Like the one that came in the car was a 2.5 liter that made, I don't know, 170 horsepower. The one that got put into the car that I realized was a 2 liter. It was a very special car, right? It was an automatic and it was a 4-speed. And yes, it did shake on the highway. Yes, the check engine light would occasionally flash. And yes, it was all-wheel drive. Kind of, right? I bought it as a winter car, so naturally you're going to want to slide it around, right? Like, why else are you buying a Subaru? And it was pretty funny because I noticed that the colder the weather would get, the more my Subaru became front-wheel drive. It was really funny, actually, because you're just, you know, if you want to, I'm going to set the scene, right? It's snowing. There's like an inch of snow, 2 inches of snow. It's not fluffy. It's not slushy. It's just nicely compacting a little bit to the point where your car drives on it and it just leaves a nice thin layer underneath the tire that becomes nice and slick. You're in your Subaru Impreza. It's snowing outside. Nice weather. You're approaching a 4-way stop. There's nobody there. There's no sidewalks. There's no ditch. There's nothing that can go wrong, right? You see the left-handed turn that you want to take, and you kind of power into it. Mid-turn, you're thinking to yourself, why am I understeering? This is weird. I'm supposed to be in an all-wheel drive car. Why am I understeering? And then, boom! The rear tires just engage, and you get sent flying into a nasty oversteer. This is something that I got a lot of laughs out of, actually, once you learn how to deal with the car. And in the first 10 minutes or so of driving the car, if you did not let it warm up sufficiently, would be so bad because you would just be driving and the car would constantly be trying to send you in a ditch if you were driving on a very low friction surface. And I think the reason for this is when the transmission oil is too cold, it doesn't have enough flow, or it doesn't have enough pressure in order to activate the clutch pack that is controlling the rear wheels. But these all-wheel drive problems became very trivial when compared to the plethora of fluids that the car would start leaking later on in its life. I'm talking coolant. I'm talking power steering. I'm talking engine oil. I'm talking all three at the same time. It got so bad that I was concerned for my safety after a certain point. It was truly something else. It was so weird because when the car was cold, the smells would transition, right? You cold start the car on like a cool spring or autumn day, right? And you are immediately starting to get hit with this burning power steering fluid smell. And it was so bad. And then right when the power steering smell starts to fade out, you get the oil smell that starts to fade in. And then you're smelling burning oil for a bit. And then once you start to go for a drive and you stop and the wind starts blowing the air everywhere, you get a little bit of a coolant smell. It's really the trifecta here. And you could always tell where you were and where the car was parked because there would always be spots of oil on the ground, which, frankly, I should have taken as a red flag when I was buying the car, but I just wanted one and the price was right at the time. There's a price for everything. And then as the weather got colder the following year, it started knocking. And the colder it was, the more it would knock. And it was so loud and evident. It was such a bad clacking, I had to get rid of the car. Either way, I think this lands the Subaru daily as, I don't really know, either E tier or A tier, depending on which one you want to go with. I had to save the best for last though, right? The last modification that I want to talk about today, arguably the most cursed, arguably the most controversial, maybe like 5 years ago, is an electric fan turbo. I'm not even going to call it an electric turbo. I'm just going to call it an electric fan because this was marketed as, it looks like a duct fan with a metal blade and like a 12-volt motor that spins at maybe 6,000 RPM. Not enough, right? It did absolutely nothing. Not entirely true. It did something. It reversed performance. It took power away from your car. Anyways, this is something that I had bought for my first car, the 2-liter Lancer that made about 150 horsepower. And I'm sitting in a restaurant one day and I see this ad on eBay, and it was very expensive at the time. It was, I think, marketed at like over $150 for this fan inside of a piece of rubber that you would put in series in your intake right after your air filter. And the general premise is that it would dramatically increase the airflow into your engine as a turbo or supercharger would. But the problem is that the style of the blade, not to mention the fact that it did not turn much at all, but the style of the blade is not that of a compressor. So just housekeeping rules here. There was zero compression happening. And if you want to get a little tech savvy, the worst part of this modification is that it was simply hopefully introducing more air into the system. And as we all know, power takes air and fuel. And when you're not tuning your car to add more fuel when it's having this additional air introduced into the equation, then your car kind of just has a little bit of a mental breakdown when you start adding air. Now, at the time, I didn't know this, but, I learned more about cars in the years following, and looking back on it, it actually makes a lot of sense. I would floor it, I would press the button to activate the fan, and my car actually slowed down. And I didn't really understand the detrimental damage I was causing to my engine doing this. Luckily, at the time, I was also reinforcing rule number 1, which was octane booster. So hopefully the octane booster at the time was allowing me to get away with doing this very stupid act, which, I think the octane booster probably kept my engine together. So it was like 2 wrongs ultimately ended up making a right. With that concludes the extreme curses that I went through in my early years of modifying cars. And I think the general takeaway from all of this is to just spend the extra money on high quality parts. In most instances, it is worth it to spend a little bit more money on a better product, or even twice as much money on a superior product, right? If you want your car to look a certain way and perform a certain way, then you have to adjust yourself to spend a certain way. And unfortunately, that's just the reality that we live in. I learned the hard way more times than I'm willing to admit in my early years of modifying cars that I opted for the cheaper part in some cases, and then it either broke or it didn't handle the way I wanted it to, didn't perform the way I wanted it to, and I ultimately ended up buying the expensive part at the end of the day. And then you're out for expensive part money plus cheap part money, plus pain in the butt factor. Needless to say, do it once and do it right. Thanks for hanging out, and until the next time.